My name is Carolyn Dean Whitfield and I am 61 years old. 14 months ago, my younger sister called me for the first time in 11 years to tell me that our mother had left a will, and that according to that will, I had inherited exactly nothing. Not the house on Birchwood Lane. Not the $1.2 million in accounts my mother had spent 30 years accumulating. Not the pearl brooch that had belonged to our grandmother. Not one single item from a list of 47 possessions that my mother had carefully divided between my sister Renee, my brother Dale, and 3 of their children. My name did not appear once in 14 pages of legal documentation. And Renee, calling me from what I later learned was the parking lot of the attorney's office, told me this with a steadiness in her voice that I recognized immediately, because I had heard that steadiness before, many times, stretched across many years. It was the voice of someone who had been waiting a long time to make this particular phone call. I want you to understand what $1.2 million means in Clarksburg, West Virginia, where I grew up. It means the kind of quiet, accumulated weight that changes what a family believes about itself. My mother, Patricia Ann Whitfield, had been a bookkeeper for 34 years at a regional insurance firm. She had clipped coupons and driven a 2003 Buick LeSabre until the transmission gave out, and she had saved with a discipline that I once admired deeply. The house on Birchwood Lane had been paid off since 2001. The accounts, a primary savings, 2 CDs, and a brokerage account her firm's financial advisor had helped her build, totaled $1,247,000 when the will was filed on September 4th of last year. I know the exact number because I eventually obtained a copy of the probate filing myself. I know that Renee received $640,000 outright. I know that Dale received the house, appraised at $312,000, plus $180,000 in liquid assets. I know that 3 grandchildren, none of them mine, because I never had children, received $25,000 each in education trusts. I know all of this because I am a forensic accountant. I have spent 31 years knowing exactly where money goes and why. But here is what none of them knew. 11 years before that phone call, before the silence, before the will, before any of it, my grandmother Loretta Mae Dean had sat across from me at her kitchen table in Elkins, West Virginia, and told me something was coming. She didn't know the exact shape of it, but she knew her daughter. And she had spent the last 4 years of her life making sure that when it arrived, I would not be standing empty-handed in a parking lot somewhere with nothing but the truth and no way to use it. Before I tell you what she left me, and what I did with it, I want to ask you to take a moment and hit the like button on this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Takes 2 seconds and it means everything to a channel like this one. And drop your city and what time it is where you are right now in the comments below. I read every single one of those and I love knowing where you all are. Now let me take you back to Clarksburg, West Virginia, in the early 1970s, and I will tell you how all of this started. I was born in 1963, the first child of Patricia and Harold Whitfield. My father worked maintenance at the paper mill outside of town. My mother kept the books for a hardware store back then, before she moved to the insurance firm. We lived in a 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, and for the first 4 years of my life, it was just the 3 of us, and I remember those years as the warmest I ever spent under that roof. Renee was born in 1967. Dale came in 1969. And something shifted in our house that I could feel before I had the language to name it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like the way a room cools down when someone leaves a window open. You don't notice it right away, but eventually you realize you've been cold for a long time. My mother had a way of organizing her love the same way she organized her ledgers, in columns, with some entries carrying more weight than others. Renee was the beautiful one. That was the word my mother used, not pretty, not cute, but beautiful, and she said it the way you'd say a fact, the way you'd say the sky is blue. Renee had my mother's dark hair and her narrow chin, and from the time she was old enough to walk into a room, my mother treated her like something she had accomplished. Dale was the boy, and in our house, in that time, in that place, that carried its own particular gravity. I was the oldest. I was the one who helped. I set the table and cleared it. I learned to make my mother's pinto bean soup from a handwritten recipe card that still smelled faintly of bacon grease, and I made it every Sunday for years because it freed my mother up to sit with Renee while she practiced piano. I was good in school, better than good. My fourth-grade teacher, Mrs. Alderman, told my mother at a parent conference that I had a gift for numbers that she hadn't seen in 20 years of teaching. My mother thanked her and then told me on the drive home that I shouldn't let it go to my head. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you this because the pattern matters. The pattern is the whole story. When Renee turned 16, my mother threw her a party in the backyard on Birchwood Lane. We had moved there by then, with 22 people, a sheet cake from the bakery downtown, and a string of white lights. My father spent an entire Saturday afternoon hanging from the fence posts. When I turned 16, my mother made a chocolate cake from a box and we ate it at the kitchen table, just the 5 of us. I counted the candles afterward. There were 15. She had miscounted, or hadn't bothered to count. I didn't say anything. I ate my slice and washed my plate and went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the wall for a while. That was the year I started spending weekends in Elkins with my grandmother Loretta. Grandma Loretta was my father's mother, and I think that alone was enough to put her outside my mother's circle of trust. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair she kept pinned up and hands that were always moving. Crocheting, sorting, writing in the journal she kept stacked on the shelf above her sewing table. She smelled like lavender hand cream and would smoke, and her house was full of books and the particular quiet of a person who had made peace with being alone. She saw me. That is the only way I know to say it. She saw me the way you see a person when you are actually looking at them, not at what you want them to be or what they remind you of. She asked me questions and then waited for the full answer. She remembered what I told her from one visit to the next. When I said I wanted to study accounting, she didn't ask me if I was sure, or suggest something more practical, or wonder aloud if that was really a field for a girl from Clarksburg. She said, "Then that's what you'll do." For words. I have carried them for 45 years. The line I remember most, though, the one that found me again and again in the hardest years. She said it to me when I was 17, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee I was too young for, but that she gave me anyway. She put her hand over mine and she said, "Carolyn, family is not the people who share your blood. Family is the people who show up when showing up costs them something." I didn't fully understand it then. I understand it completely now. My father was a quiet man. Not a weak one. I want to be clear about that. But quiet in the way that some men are quiet when they have decided that the cost of speaking is higher than they can afford. He worked long shifts. He came home tired. He loved us in the way he knew how, which was mostly through presence and occasionally through small gestures. A candy bar left on my pillow, a drive out to the river on Sunday afternoons. He was not a man who intervened in my mother's arrangements. I don't think he understood them fully. I think he saw the surface and trusted that the surface was the whole thing. He was wrong. But I didn't know that yet. The summer I turned 18, I applied to West Virginia University on my own. I had researched the application process, written my essays in the school library on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and asked Mrs. Alderman, who was now teaching high school math, to write me a letter of recommendation. I was accepted in March of 1981 with a partial academic scholarship that covered about 40% of tuition. I went to my mother and asked about the rest. I had heard her mention, more than once, that she and my father had been setting money aside for college. I had heard this. I had filed it away the way I filed everything, carefully, in the right place, against future need. My mother sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten my 15-candle birthday cake, and she told me that the college fund had been reorganized. She used that word, reorganized. She said that given Renee's talent for music, they had decided to concentrate the savings toward Renee's eventual conservatory education, which would be significantly more expensive than a state school accounting program. She said this the way she said most things, matter-of-factly, with the mild impatience of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. I did not cry. I did not say a single word for what I later estimated was close to 30 seconds. Then I asked her how much was in the fund originally. She told me it was none of my concern. I found out later, years later, through a document my grandmother had kept, that the fund had contained $18,400 at the time of that conversation. Renee used $14,000 of it for 2 years at a music program in Pittsburgh before dropping out to get married. Dale used the remaining $4,400 for a semester at a technical college. Renee's conservatory education, the one that had justified reorganizing the fund away from me, never happened. I went to WVU on the scholarship in 2 part-time jobs, one at the university library, shelving books from 6 to 10 a.m. before my first class, and one at a diner on Route 33 on Friday and Saturday nights. I ate a lot of ramen and a lot of peanut butter on white bread. I shared a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Beechust Avenue with a girl named Sandra Pruitt, who became my closest friend and who is, to this day, the person I call first when anything important happens. I graduated in 1985 with a 3.91 GPA and a job offer from a regional accounting firm in Charleston. I did not go home for the summer. I loaded my things into a second-hand Datsun and drove south, and I told myself I was not running from anything. I was running toward something. I mostly believed it. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think some of you know exactly what I'm describing. Not the specifics, maybe, but the feeling. The feeling of being in a family and being somehow beside it at the same time. Of watching love get distributed in a room and understanding, without anyone saying it directly, that the distribution was not equal and was not going to become equal. If you've ever sat at a table and felt invisible to the people who were supposed to see you most clearly, drop the word table in the comments. I want to know you're out there. And if this story is resonating with you, please hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one on this channel, and I don't want you to miss them. Now, back to the story. The years between 1985 and 1996 were the years I built something out of nothing, and I want to give them their proper weight because I think those years are often rushed past in stories like this one, as if the survival part is just a bridge to the revenge part. It wasn't. Those years were the substance of my life. I worked at the Charleston firm for 4 years, and then moved to a larger firm in Pittsburgh, where Sandra had settled after graduate school. I got my CPA license in 1987. I got a master's degree in accounting from Duquesne University in 1991, taking evening classes for 3 years while working full-time. I met my husband, Gerald, in 1989. He was a civil engineer, a calm and steady man who had grown up in a small town in Ohio and who understood, without me having to explain it at length, what it meant to come from a family that had not always been kind. We married in 1992 in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside Pittsburgh. 14 people attended. My grandmother Loretta was there, in a cream-colored dress she had made herself, and she danced with Gerald at the reception and told him she approved of him, which made him laugh and made me cry, which was the only time I cried that whole day. My parents did not attend. My mother sent a card with a check for $75 and a note that said, "Wishing you happiness." Renee did not respond to her invitation. Dale sent a text message. This was early days for mobile phones. That said he was sorry he couldn't make it. I did not call them. I filed the card in a box and I moved forward. My grandmother called me the morning after the wedding. She said, "I have something I need to tell you, and I want to do it in person. Can you come to Elkins before the end of the month?" I drove to Elkins on a Saturday in October 1992, and I sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and she told me that she had been working with an attorney in Elkins for the past 3 years on her estate planning. She told me that she had a small but meaningful amount saved. She had been careful her whole life, the same way my mother had been careful, but for different reasons, and that she had made decisions about where it would go. She told me that she had set aside $85,000 in a trust specifically for me, structured so that it would not be accessible or visible to my mother or siblings, and would pass to me upon her death with no involvement from anyone else in the family. She also told me she had kept records. I looked at her across that table and I said, "Records of what?" She reached into the cabinet above the sewing table, and she brought out a wooden box with brass hinges, about the size of a shoebox, made of dark walnut, and she set it in front of me. She said, "I've been watching your mother for a long time, Carolyn. I watched what she did with the college money. I watched the party she gave Renee and the cake she gave you. I watched her tell your father things about you that weren't true, to keep him from asking questions. I have written down what I saw, and I have kept letters, and I have kept the bank statements your father sent me when he was worried and didn't know who else to talk to." She put her hand on the lid of the box. "This is yours. Not now. Keep it here with me for now. But when the time comes, you'll know what to do with it." I didn't open the box that day. I trusted her completely, and I understood that she was not giving me a weapon. She was giving me a record. There is a difference, and it matters. Grandma Loretta died on March 7, 1997, at the age of 82, in her own house in Elkins, with her cat on the bed and her journals on the shelf and her hands folded over the crocheted blanket she had made the winter before. I was with her. Sandra drove me down and waited in the kitchen, and I sat with my grandmother for the last 4 hours of her life, and I held her hand and I did not let go. Her attorney, a man named Robert Calhoun who had an office above a hardware store on Davis Avenue, contacted me 6 days later. The trust transferred to me without incident. $85,000, plus 11 years of modest growth, came to $103,400. I put it in a separate account and I did not touch it. He also gave me the wooden box. I carried it home to Pittsburgh wrapped in a sweater in the back seat of my car, and I put it on the top shelf of my closet, And for the next 11 years, I left it there. Not because I forgot about it. Because I was waiting for the time my grandmother had spoken of, and I had learned from her how to be patient. The call from my mother came on a Tuesday in April of 2008. I was 44 years old. I had been promoted to senior partner at the accounting firm I joined in 1997, a mid-sized firm in Pittsburgh that specialized in forensic accounting and estate dispute work, which I note without irony. Gerald and I had bought a house in the North Hills, a white colonial with a blue door and a garden that I tended on weekends. We had 2 dogs and a good life and a circle of friends who were, to use my grandmother's definition, the people who showed up when showing up cost them something. My mother's voice on the phone was different from what I remembered. Smaller, somehow. She said she had been thinking about things. She said she was getting older. She was 68, and she didn't want there to be distance between us anymore. She said she wanted me to come home for Thanksgiving. She said Renee and Dale would both be there, and their families, and she thought it was time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was something more careful than either of those things. A kind of watchfulness, the same feeling I get when a set of financial records is too clean, when everything adds up too perfectly and you know that means someone has been working very hard to make it look that way. I said I would think about it. I called Sandra that evening and she said, "What do you think she wants?" I said I didn't know yet. Sandra said, "You'll find out." I went to Thanksgiving. Gerald came with me. We drove to Clarksburg on a Wednesday afternoon in November 2008, and we stayed at a Holiday Inn on the edge of town because I had not offered to stay at the house and my mother had not offered to have us, which told me something. The house on Birchwood Lane looked the same from the outside. The inside had been updated. New kitchen counters, a flat-screen television in the living room, carpet replaced with hardwood floors. My mother looked older, which of course she was, but she also looked prosperous is the word I keep coming back to. She was wearing a camel-colored blazer over pressed slacks, and her hair was done, and there was a Hermes scarf at her neck that I recognized because I had priced them once while shopping with a client. Renee was there with her husband, Carl, and their 2 teenagers. Dale was there with his wife, Kim, and their 3 kids. It was the first time I had been in a room with all of them in 11 years, and I watched the room the way I watch a set of financial records, looking for the pattern underneath the surface. Dinner was fine. My mother was warm in a practiced way. She asked about my work with the careful interest of someone who has rehearsed the question. Renee was pleasant. Dale was quieter than I remembered, and once or twice I caught him looking at me with something in his face that I couldn't quite read. Not hostility, but not ease either. Something more like guilt, which I filed away. After dinner, while the others were in the living room, my mother asked me to help her in the kitchen. She handed me a dish towel and she said, without preamble, "Your father's health is not good." I said I was sorry to hear that. She said his heart was giving him trouble, and that the doctors had told him he needed to reduce his stress. She said one of the things causing him stress was the state of his finances, that they had made some investments over the years that hadn't performed the way they'd hoped, and that the mortgage on the house, which they had taken out in 2004 to fund some of those investments, was becoming difficult to manage on their fixed income. I dried a casserole dish and I waited. She said she thought it would be meaningful, given the reconciliation she hoped we were beginning, if I could consider contributing to a family fund that she and Renee and Dale were putting together to help stabilize things. She said she wasn't asking for anything specific yet. She just wanted to plant the seed. I put the dish towel on the counter. I looked at my mother for a long moment. I said, "I appreciate you telling me, Mom." I did not say yes. I did not say no. I said, "Let me think about what I can do." She patted my hand and said, "I knew you'd understand. You always were the responsible one." I want to pause here again, because I think some of you just felt something in your chest when you heard that. You always were the responsible one, said by the same woman who had taken the college fund and given you a 15-candle birthday cake. Said as a compliment, when what it really meant was, you're the one we call when we need something. If you've ever been the responsible one in your family, and you know exactly what that means, type responsible in the comments. I see you. I have been you. And please, if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this story is not over, and you are going to want to be here for what comes next. Back to the story. I drove back to Pittsburgh the next morning and I told Gerald everything. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, with his coffee cup in both hands. When I finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to get the box." I spent the next 3 weeks going through everything my grandmother had kept. There were 31 handwritten journal entries spanning from 1978 to 1996, each one dated, each one describing specific incidents she had witnessed or been told about directly. There were 14 letters, some from my father, written during periods of marital strain, describing financial decisions my mother had made unilaterally. There were bank statements showing the original college fund balance and its disbursements. There were 2 letters from my grandmother to my mother, never sent, that she had written and kept as a record of her own thinking. And there was a sealed envelope at the bottom of the box, addressed to me in my grandmother's handwriting, with a note on the outside that said, "Carolyn, open this when the time comes. You will know when." I opened it. It was 4 pages, handwritten, dated January 14, 1997, 8 weeks before she died. She had written it knowing she was close to the end. She described, in the methodical way she described everything, what she believed my mother had done and would do. She said she believed my mother would eventually attempt to draw me back in when she needed something, and that I should be careful not to confuse need with love. She said she believed there was a meaningful estate. She didn't know the exact amount, but she knew my mother's habits, and that she suspected I would be excluded from it, and that I should be prepared for that. She said she had left me not just the money but the records because she wanted me to have the ability to respond from a place of truth rather than emotion. And then she wrote this. "You have always been the clearest-eyed person in that family, Carolyn. That is why they have always been uncomfortable with you. Clear eyes are inconvenient to people who prefer the fog. Use your eyes. Use your training. And remember that the truth does not need to be loud to be heard." I read that letter 4 times. I did not cry. I noticed that. I called Robert Calhoun, my grandmother's attorney, who was now in his 70s but still practicing, and I asked him to recommend a probate and estate attorney in Pittsburgh. He gave me a name. I made an appointment. Over the next several months, I also did something that my professional training made natural. I documented everything. I kept a record of every contact from my mother. Phone calls logged with dates and times, emails printed and filed, the Thanksgiving conversation reconstructed from memory and dated. I opened a navy blue binder, and I began organizing what I had into a coherent sequence. My mother called 4 more times over the following year. Each call circled back, eventually, to the family fund. The ask grew more specific, $40,000 initially, then $60,000 when I didn't respond to the first number, then, in a call on March 3, 2010, $85,000, which I noted was exactly the amount my grandmother had left me, a coincidence that I did not believe was a coincidence. I said I was still thinking. I said I wanted to understand the full picture before I made any decisions. My mother said she appreciated my thoroughness. She did not know that my thoroughness was the problem. In July of 2010, my father had a heart attack. It was not fatal, but it was serious, and I drove to Clarksburg and I spent 4 days at the hospital. It was during those 4 days that something changed between my father and me. Something that had been locked for a long time began, slowly, to open. He was in a hospital bed on the 3rd floor of the medical center, and on the second afternoon, when my mother had gone to the cafeteria and Renee was in the hallway on her phone, my father looked at me from the bed and said, "Carolyn." Just my name. The way you say someone's name when you've been meaning to say it for a long time. I sat down in the chair beside him. He said, "I didn't always do right by you." I said, "Dad, you don't need to." He said, "I know I don't need to. I want to." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother. She has a way of making things seem like they're already decided. I let her do that more than I should have." He looked at the ceiling. "The college money. I knew about that. I want you to know I knew, and I should have said something, and I didn't." I held his hand. I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "You turned out fine. Better than fine." He squeezed my hand once. "Your grandmother always said you would." That was the most my father ever said to me about any of it. But it was enough. It was the thing I had needed to hear for 29 years, and I received it without ceremony, and without making him carry it longer than he had to. My father recovered. He lived another 9 years, until 2019, when he died quietly at home on a Tuesday morning in September. My mother called me that afternoon. She said the funeral would be Saturday. She said she assumed I would come. I did come. I sat in the 3rd pew and I looked at my father's face in the casket and I thought about the hospital room in 2010 and the way he had said my name. At the reception afterward, held at the house on Birchwood Lane, Renee pulled me aside in the hallway near the stairs and told me that Mom was doing the will soon, and that I should know there had been some adjustments made over the years. She said it with a careful neutrality that I recognized as the voice of someone who knows something and has decided not to feel bad about it. She said, "I just want you to be prepared." I said, "Thank you, Renee." She looked at me for a moment, as if she was trying to determine whether I understood what she was telling me. I understood completely. I drove back to Pittsburgh that evening and I called my attorney and I told her to be ready. My mother died on June 12th of last year, at the age of 83. She had been in declining health for 2 years. A series of small strokes had taken pieces of her, gradually, until the last piece went. I had visited her twice in the nursing facility, both times alone, both times brief. She was not cruel in those visits. She was also not warm. She was, mostly, herself, organized in her thinking, precise in her speech, careful about what she said and did not say. On my second visit, 3 months before she died, she looked at me across the small table in the common room and she said, "You've done well for yourself." I said, I have. She said, I always knew you would. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the 15 candles. I thought about the reorganized college fund. I thought about the Thanksgiving kitchen and the dish towel, and you always were the responsible one. I thought about my grandmother's letter, and the navy blue binder and 31 years of careful documentation. I said, I know you did, Mom. That was the last real conversation we had. Renee called me on September 9th of last year, a Saturday morning at 10:22 a.m., from the parking lot of the attorney's office. She told me about the will. She told me my name did not appear. She told me the numbers. She was steady and careful in the way of someone delivering information they have been given permission to deliver. When she finished, I said, Thank you for telling me. She said, I thought you should hear it from me. I said, I appreciate that. There was a pause. Then she said, Are you okay? I said, I'm fine, Renee. I genuinely was. Because I had been waiting for this for a long time, and I was ready, and I had everything I needed in a navy blue binder on the shelf above my desk. My attorney filed a formal notice of contest on September 23rd. The grounds were multiple: undue influence, breach of fiduciary duty related to the college fund, and a documented pattern of financial manipulation spanning from 1981 to 2008, supported by 31 dated journal entries, 14 letters, original bank statements, and a sworn affidavit from Robert Calhoun, who was 84 years old and still sharp, and who had known my grandmother for 40 years, and was more than willing to speak to what she had told him. The will contest triggered a probate hearing, and the hearing required a mediation session first, which was scheduled for November 14th of last year at 10 a.m. In a conference room at the probate court in Clarksburg. I arrived at 9:47 a.m. in a charcoal gray suit and low heels, with Gerald beside me and my attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt who had been doing estate litigation for 22 years, on my other side. I had the navy blue binder in my hands. I had read everything in it so many times that I could have recited it in sequence without looking. Renee and Dale were already in the conference room when we arrived, seated on one side of the long table with their attorney, a man I had never met, and two other people I recognized as Renee's husband Carl, and a woman I didn't know who turned out to be a paralegal from the estate attorney's office. The mediator, a retired judge named Howard Bates, sat at the head of the table. Two court staff were present. There were 9 people in that room, not counting me and Gerald and Patricia. Renee looked at the binder in my hands. Something moved across her face. Judge Bates opened the session by explaining the process. He said we were here to explore whether a resolution could be reached before the matter went to a full hearing. He said both parties would have the opportunity to present their positions. He said he expected everyone to remain civil. Patricia opened for our side. She was calm and precise. She reminded me, in the best way, of my grandmother. She laid out the timeline. She described the college fund. She described the pattern of financial exclusion. She described the 2008 Thanksgiving conversation and the subsequent calls requesting money. She described the documentation. Then she nodded to me, and I opened the binder. I had organized the exhibits in chronological order, labeled A through AJ, 36 items in total. I began with Exhibit A, a bank statement from 1981 showing the college fund balance of $18,400. I read the balance aloud. I described what the fund had been represented to me as and what it had actually been used for. Renee said, "That was 40 years ago." I did not look up. I turned to Exhibit B. Exhibit B was a journal entry from my grandmother, dated March 3, 1982, describing a conversation she had witnessed between my mother and father about the college fund reallocation. It was specific. It named amounts. It named dates. It was in my grandmother's handwriting, which Robert Calhoun had authenticated in his affidavit. Dale said, "Where did you get that?" I said, "Your grandmother kept it." There was a silence in the room. I continued through the exhibits in order. I did not rush. I did not editorialize. I read dates and amounts and direct quotations from letters and journal entries, and I placed each exhibit on the table as I finished with it, face up, in a neat row. By Exhibit M, my father's letter to my grandmother from 2003, describing his concern about financial decisions being made without his knowledge. The room had gotten very quiet. Renee said, "Dad wrote that." I said, "He did." Robert Calhoun received it by mail on October 14, 2003. The postmark is on the envelope, which is Exhibit N. Carl put his hand on Renee's arm. By Exhibit T, the log of phone calls from my mother between 2008 and 2010, with the escalating requests for money. Dale's attorney leaned over and said something quietly to him. Dale nodded slowly. By Exhibit AC, my grandmother's letter to me, the 4-page handwritten letter from January 1997, which I read aloud in full. Renee was crying. Not the performative crying of someone trying to manage a room. The other kind. The kind that comes from recognition. My voice did not waver. I noticed that. When I finished reading the letter, I closed the binder. I set it on the table. I folded my hands on top of it and I looked at Judge Bates and I said, "That concludes our presentation." There was a long moment of silence. Then Dale said, "I didn't know about the college fund. I want to say that. I didn't know the specifics." His attorney put a hand on his arm, but Dale kept going. He said, "I knew things weren't. I knew it wasn't equal. But I didn't know the specifics." Renee said, "Mom told us you chose to leave. That you didn't want to be part of the family." I looked at her. I said, "I know that's what she told you." Renee pressed her hands flat on the table. She said, "Carolyn." She stopped. She started again. "I didn't know she was calling you asking for money. I want you to know that. I didn't know about those calls." I believed her. I still do. My mother had been running separate ledgers for a long time. The mediation lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. At 2:14 in the afternoon, Renee and Dale's attorney asked for a recess to confer with his clients. The recess lasted 41 minutes. When they came back, he presented a settlement offer. The offer was $380,000, a negotiated share of the liquid estate, structured as a settlement payment to avoid a full probate hearing. It was not the $640,000 Renee had received. It was not the $312,000 house plus $180,000 that Dale had received. But it was a number arrived at through documentation and truth, and it was real, and it was mine. Patricia and I stepped out of the room and she asked me what I wanted to do. I stood in the hallway of the Clarksburg probate court and I thought about my grandmother's kitchen table, and the wooden box with brass hinges and the 4-page letter and the 31 journal entries. I thought about the laundromat apartment and the library shifts at 6 a.m. and the peanut butter sandwiches and the 15 candles on a birthday cake. I thought about my father's hand in the hospital and the way he said my name. I said, "Accept it." The settlement was signed on November 14th of last year at 3:52 in the afternoon. I shook Judge Bates's hand. I shook the other attorney's hand. I walked out of the building with Gerald and Patricia into a cold November afternoon, and Gerald put his arm around me, and I stood on the courthouse steps and looked out at the street where I had grown up, and I breathed. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was more like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you've been carrying for so long you forgot it wasn't part of you. A kind of lightness that was also a kind of grief, because the truth is that justice and loss are not opposites. Sometimes they arrive together. In the months since the settlement, things have unfolded the way things do when truth has been documented and witnessed. Renee's husband, Carl, who had been a business partner with the estate attorney in a separate real estate venture, quietly dissolved that partnership in January. The estate attorney was reported to the state bar by an anonymous party. I do not know who, and I did not make that call, for a separate matter involving another estate. The bar inquiry is ongoing. Dale called me in February and asked if he could take me to lunch the next time I was in Clarksburg. I said yes. We had lunch at a diner on Main Street, and he talked for most of it, and at the end he said, "I'm sorry I wasn't better." I said, "I know." We hugged in the parking lot. It was the first time we had hugged since I was probably 20 years old. Renee sent me a letter in March. 4 pages, handwritten. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said she understood, now, that she had been my mother's instrument in ways she hadn't fully recognized while it was happening. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted me to know that she was sorry. She said she had been in therapy since the mediation. She said she hoped, in time, we might find our way to something. I read the letter twice. I put it in the wooden box with the brass hinges, beside my grandmother's letter, and I closed the lid. I have not responded yet. I'm not sure I will, not soon. Forgiveness is something I am working on for my own sake, not for Renee's, and it moves at its own pace. What I know is that I do not carry anger. I carry documentation. There is a difference. My mother never apologized. I did not expect her to. She was, until the end, a woman who had organized her world in columns and believed her columns were correct. I think she believed, genuinely, that she had given each of her children what they needed, that Renee needed beauty and music and a party with white lights, and that I needed nothing because I was capable of providing for myself. I think she mistook capability for independence and independence for not needing love. I think she was wrong in a way that cost her something she didn't know she was losing until it was too late to recover it. I am not her judge. I am only her daughter. A daughter who kept records and waited for the right time and trusted what a small woman with white hair and lavender hand cream had told her at a kitchen table 45 years ago. The $380,000 is in an account. I have not spent most of it. Some of it I put toward the garden Gerald and I have been expanding. We built a greenhouse last spring, and on Sunday mornings I go out there with my coffee and I stand among the plants in the early light, and I think about what it means to grow something slowly, in the right conditions, with patience. Some of it I used to establish a small scholarship at WVU for first-generation accounting students who demonstrate financial need. The scholarship is named the Loretta May Dean Award. The first recipient was a young woman from McDowell County who reminded me, in her application essay, of myself at 18, clear-eyed and careful in building something out of nothing. I think my grandmother would have approved. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in some part of this story, if you have been the responsible one, the one who was told to be grateful for less, the one who left and rebuilt and wondered for years whether you were right to do it, I want to say something to you directly. You were right. Not because you won something, but because you knew the truth and you kept it, and you waited, and you did not let anyone talk you out of what you had seen with your own clear eyes. The truth does not need to be loud to be heard. My grandmother told me that, and she was right, and I have tried to live it. Family is not always the people who share your blood. Family is the people who show up when showing up costs them something. I have a husband who has shown up for 32 years. I have a best friend named Sandra who drove me to Elkins when my grandmother was dying and waited in the kitchen so I wouldn't be alone. I have colleagues and neighbors and a woman at my church who brings me tomatoes from her garden every August and asks nothing in return. I have a grandmother who has been gone for 27 years and who is still, somehow, the clearest voice in the room when I need to hear one. That is my family. That is the one I chose and the one that chose me back. The wooden box with the brass hinges sits on the shelf in my study now, beside my grandmother's journals and a photograph of the two of us at her kitchen table. Me at 17, her small and white-haired and smiling, her hand over mine. I look at it sometimes when I'm working late. I look at it and I think about patience and documentation and the particular kind of courage it takes to wait for the right moment and then walk into a room with a binder and let the truth do what truth does. It doesn't shout. Doesn't have to. Just sits on the table, in order, labeled A through AJ, and it waits for everyone else to stop talking. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment below. Tell me your city. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me if any part of this felt familiar. I read every single one. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.